September 13, 1951. The Central Korean Mountains, near Yanggu. Lieutenant Elliot Kaufman looked up at the ridgeline that his platoon had been ordered to take and made the professional assessment that combat officers learn to make quickly in wars where the same orders are given repeatedly, and where the results of previous attempts to execute those orders are visible in the casualties that have been evacuated and in the men who have not come back. The ridgeline ahead was one of a series of rocky peaks in the Central Korean mountains that the military maps designated with elevation numbers, and that the soldiers who were fighting for them had given names that captured something about the character of what they were experiencing. Heartbreak Ridge. The name had emerged from the same informal soldier vocabulary that had named the punch bowl, the circular valley that the ridges overlooked, and that described in specific human terms what fighting for that terrain cost the men who fought for it. Heartbreak Ridge was not one ridge but a series of ridges, the main peaks designated Hill 931 and Hill 894 and Hill 851, connected by a spine of high ground that the North Korean People's Army had fortified with the thoroughness of soldiers who had been in place long enough to understand the terrain and to build defensive systems that used that terrain to maximum effect. The NKPA defenders who held Heartbreak Ridge were not the improvised defenders of a position that had been hastily occupied. They were soldiers who had been rotated through the position, who had built the bunkers and the tunnels and the fighting positions that characterized the mature defensive systems of the Korean War static phase, who understood that every approach to the ridge from below was covered by fire from positions above, and that every position was connected by tunnels to positions adjacent and below that allowed defenders to reinforce threatened positions or withdraw from positions that were about to be overrun. The battle that began on September 13, 1951, was not supposed to last 10 weeks. The original estimate, based on intelligence assessments that proved to be as wrong about Heartbreak Ridge as MacArthur's intelligence had been about the Japanese bunkers at Buna 9 years earlier, was that the ridge would fall in 5 days. It took 77 days. The 2nd Infantry Division, whose units alternated in the assault on Heartbreak Ridge over those 77 days, suffered approximately 3,700 casualties in a battle for a ridgeline that was eventually taken in October 1951 and then incorporated into the ceasefire line when the armistice negotiations at Panmunjom finally concluded in 1953. Kaufman's platoon was one of dozens of platoons that made assault after assault on the ridges of Heartbreak during the 77 days of the battle. The pattern that emerged in the first days and repeated itself throughout the campaign was as predictable as it was costly. American artillery and mortar fire would prepare the assault, attempting to suppress the defensive positions that intelligence had identified. The suppression was partial at best, because the bunkers and tunnels that the NKPA had built were designed to survive exactly the kinds of artillery preparation that American doctrine specified. When the artillery lifted and the infantry moved up the slope, the defenders who had survived in their bunkers emerged and manned their weapons. The infantry went up the slope anyway. Going up a Korean mountain in September was not what it would be in January, but it was not easy. The slopes of Heartbreak Ridge were steep enough to require climbing in places, covered with the loose shale and rocky soil that Korean mountains above the tree line produced, offering no cover from the fire that came from above. Men who were hit on the slopes could not easily be evacuated until darkness, because the approach routes were under observation and under fire, and moving a casualty down a steep slope under fire required men whose effort on the casualty removed from the assault. Corporal Leonard Pieper, who fought with the 9th Infantry Regiment on Heartbreak Ridge in September 1951 and who recorded his experiences in letters home that were preserved by his family, described the specific experience of assaulting the ridge in terms that captured the physical reality of what the fighting required. "You climb," Pieper wrote. "Your hands and your feet and your rifle and your ammunition, that is all you have. The rocks cut your hands. The slope is steep enough that you lean forward and use your hands sometimes. And the whole time you are going up, there are men above you who are trying to kill you, and the only thing between you and them is your speed and the hope that the artillery scared them enough that they are slow getting back to their weapons. Most of the time, the artillery doesn't scare them enough. The artillery that prepared the assault and the artillery that supported it were not sufficient for the task that Heartbreak Ridge presented, not because the guns were inadequate or the crews untrained, but because the defensive system that had been built into the ridgeline was designed specifically to survive artillery preparation and to allow the defenders to return to their positions in the time between the end of the artillery and the arrival of the infantry. The solution that the 2nd Division eventually developed was the same solution that American forces had developed at Buna and Paleliu and every other defended position where the defensive system was too integrated with the terrain to be suppressed by indirect fire alone. Close the range. Get the infantry close enough that the defenders could not survive in their positions, and then hold the positions long enough to destroy the tunnels and bunkers that allowed them to return. The problem with this solution on Heartbreak Ridge was that closing the range required getting the infantry to the top of the ridge under fire, and holding the top of the ridge after taking it required holding positions that were under observation and fire from adjacent ridges that the Americans did not control and could not easily take. The NKPA commanders who had built the Heartbreak Ridge defensive system had built it with exactly this problem in mind. The ridge could be taken at the cost of significant casualties. But holding the top of the ridge once taken exposed the holders to fire from positions that had not been taken and could not be suppressed by the forces available to hold the main position. The result was a pattern that repeated throughout the battle. American forces would assault the ridge, take the top, hold it through the night under counterattack from NKPA forces that used their tunnel system to reinforce positions that had been cleared, and then either hold at great cost or give up positions that were not sustainable, only to have to assault the same positions again. Sergeant First Class Stanley Adams, leading a platoon of the 19th Infantry on Heartbreak Ridge in October 1951, earned the Medal of Honor in an action that captured the specific character of what the Ridge battle required. His company had taken a position near the top of Hill 1052, adjacent to the main Heartbreak Ridge positions, when a counterattack by a numerically superior North Korean force threatened to overrun the position. Adams personally led the counterattack that stopped the NKPA assault, advancing alone in front of his men to engage the attacking force at close range, continuing to fight after being wounded, accounting for approximately 50 enemy soldiers killed before the counterattack was stopped. He had done what the situation required, which was the kind of thing that the situation on Heartbreak Ridge was requiring every day of the 77 days that the battle lasted. The armistice negotiations at Panmunjom that were ongoing throughout the Heartbreak Ridge battle added a specific moral weight to the casualties that the ridge was producing. The negotiators at Panmunjom were discussing, among other things, the precise location of the ceasefire line that would define the boundary between North and South Korea when the armistice eventually was signed. The ceasefire line, in the negotiations that were underway in the fall of 1951, was going to be drawn along the existing line of contact between the opposing forces, with modifications negotiated at the table. The terrain features that American forces held or did not hold at the moment of the ceasefire would determine where the line was drawn. This created a strategic logic for fighting on Heartbreak Ridge that was separate from the tactical logic of whether the ridge itself had military value sufficient to justify the casualties required to hold it. If holding the ridge contributed to a more favorable ceasefire line, then the casualties might be worth it in a strategic accounting that the men paying those casualties could not always see from their positions on the slopes. Whether this accounting was correct, whether the terrain gained at Heartbreak Ridge and similar battles during the armistice negotiation period contributed to a ceasefire line significantly more favorable than what could have been negotiated without those battles, has been debated by Korean War historians without definitive resolution. What is not debated is what the men of the 2nd Infantry Division did on the slopes of Heartbreak Ridge for 77 days in the fall of 1951. They went up the ridge. They took it. They were pushed off it. They went up again. Private First Class Cleo Bailey, who served with the 23rd Infantry on Heartbreak Ridge and who was one of the men who made multiple assaults on the same positions over multiple weeks, described the specific psychology of the battle in terms that no official account of the campaign captured. After a while you stop thinking about why, Bailey said. You stop thinking about the negotiations at Panmunjom and whether the ridge was worth it. You thought about the man beside you and the man in front of you and the man behind you. You thought about whether the position you were in was going to hold through the night. You thought about ammunition and water and whether the casualty could be moved. That is all there was. The big picture was somewhere else. On that ridge, it was just the ridge. He was right. On the ridge, it was just the ridge. The men who fought on Heartbreak Ridge for 77 days were not fighting for geopolitical objectives or for ceasefire line negotiations. They were fighting because the man beside them needed them to fight and because stopping was something that American soldiers do not do when they have been given a position to hold. The ridge was declared secured on October 15, 1951. The 2nd Infantry Division had been fighting for it since September 13. The total duration of the battle had been 77 days. The original estimate had been 5. The men who took Heartbreak Ridge had taken it at a cost that the 5-day estimate could not have imagined. And they had taken it because American soldiers take what they are ordered to take, even when the taking takes 77 days instead of 5, even when the cost exceeds every estimate, even when the question of whether it is worth taking cannot be answered from the slope of the hill. They took it. They held it. That was enough.